Hello, everybody. Welcome to Strategy and Future. My name is Jacek Bartosiak, and my guest is today our senior fellow at Strategy and Future, Nicholas Myers, who is running also his website War and Peace, which is highly recommended and very worth looking into the in-depth analysis of the Russian behavior, Russians posturing and strategic signaling. Hello, Nicholas.
Hello, Jacek. How are you today?
I am fine. How about you?
Oh, I'm holding in there somehow.
And today, and these days are very peculiar days, or special days, special in a way that the Russians are really posturing as we speak. We talk on the 20th of April at 1 p.m. Warsaw time, Central European time, and we will be discussing the Russian posturing, the Russian deployments around Ukraine, and this dance, strategic dance that the Russians and others are playing. Nick, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Jacek. So yes, as he's already mentioned, today is April 20th, 2021. So anything after this point starts to become difficult for me to predict. But we spoke about 2 weeks ago about the progression of this Russian military buildup that's being widely reported as occurring around the Ukrainian borders. And one of the things that's been most peculiar about this whole buildup is that unlike even the 2014 buildup against Ukraine, this one has really not been very widely reported by Russian sources themselves. If you go to any Russian blog that written by somebody who knows what they're talking about, or look at the Russian Ministry of Defense press releases about the events going on, they are not discussing this very much. So this is primarily being initially reported by individuals looking at various images in the West. And then, of course, it was much amplified by the United States reaffirming Ukrainian claims that there was a military buildup going on. So for a long time, information that we would generally use for open source research of what's going on in Russia was difficult to come by because the Russians weren't talking about it. And the only thing the Russians did want to talk about was the supposed Ukrainian military buildup in the Donbass, which there had been some rhetorical buildup since the inauguration of President Biden a couple months ago. But I have not seen too much evidence of an actual Ukrainian military surge, though perhaps this is part of a more hopeful thinking in Kiev that with a more European-aligned president in Washington, it might be easier to get some backing for an offensive into the Donbass to reclaim the territory. But this all changed pretty much almost exactly when we were talking last time, when Shoigu visited, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited Murmansk, the Northern Fleet base, and was giving a speech about how they were upgrading the submarine pens for all sorts of modernization going on up there, and mentioned that this was actually, there was in fact a snap check, the Snapnaya Proverka going on in the Western and Southern military districts using assets that were moving 2 armies and 3 airborne troops units to the West as a response to the Defender Europe 2021 exercise family that's starting to get underway in Europe now, which is, I don't know if the formal events have yet started, but the United States is moving a significant number of troops over from North America into Europe at the moment. And usually it's not a single exercise. It's probably going to be distributed over a couple of exercises within a unified scenario over the next couple of weeks. But this was an interesting admission because, first of all, it was the first time the Russians had even acknowledged that a buildup was going on the border. And secondly, it was a complete diversion from what the Russians had been saying before, that anything that was going on was in response to Ukraine's buildup. Shoigu specifically mentioned this as being in response to NATO's buildup going on along the Russian borders. But Shoigu also said that this was within the framework of the Kontrolnaya Proverka schedule, which is something we did discuss last time, which is typical for April at the end of the winter training season. If I look back over the past 5 years of the times where the Russian Western Military District has exercised more than 5,000 troops in a proverka or other alert style of exercise, about 25% of them, of those particular weeks, have been in April. And then another 25% are in September or October, which is the analogous period for the summer season. And the rest are in January, where they usually do some large scale, can we get the conscripts to actually show up? So it's not especially unusual that it is happening at this time of year, but it also puts a hard deadline at the point at which this is no longer an exercise, is now quite unusual, which is at about 2 weeks from now. If they're still there, then something strange is going on. But if this is the prelude to an attack, these forces are already quite visible, so the element of surprise is gone. And the indications are that they're all exercising at established polygons and not at concentration points leading into an attack. Let's see if I may have a map to share in a moment to show where some of these concentrations are. But
okay, sharing authorized, Nick.
Thank you. But what I can say from the formal releases being put out by the Ministry of Defense since that time is that the two armies appear to be concentrating in Crimea and Voronezh Oblast up here northeast of Luhansk in Ukraine. The 58th Army has been openly acknowledged by the Russian Ministry of Defense as exercising at Opuk polygon, which is out here in the far eastern section of Crimea. And then the open source analysis shows that it's primarily the 41st Army from Siberia that is out here in Voronezh. It's quite interesting because the 41st Army for a long time was probably the most prolifically reporting units in the Russian Ministry of Defense. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are the most ready or capable, but it does mean that they had the most active public affairs officer at the very least. And those exercises back in Siberia have largely abated. There's been, I think, 2 reported since the start of this snap check in retrospect started. And both of them have been unusual in that they've been reported from multiple polygons at once, as opposed to typically they would say that this one's happening at Kemerovo Oblast or at Altai Krai. So for reference, that's way, way out here. This Kemerovo is this one here, and Altai Krai, this section here. This is where the 41st Army is based. So they all entrained and moved way out to Voronezh Oblast. Again, this isn't especially unusual because of the nature of the Russian military needing to be ready to go across the entire country from time to time. But to do it at such a large scale without doing any boasting that the Russian military can do it is a bit unusual, because usually the Russian Ministry of Defense is quite happy to say, look what we can do. Shouldn't you all be worried about us? The other interesting trend I have seen over the past couple of days, specifically since the start of this previous weekend, is that whereas some analysts had been saying that there's a shortage of logistics units and field hospitals being deployed with these units going out there, we're now seeing that the Russians appear to be specifically trolling that. So General Breedlove... Trolling, yes.
This is deception, I mean. Maskirovka, yeah. Deception the other way around or something, right?
In a sense. It's interesting because they've been putting out some pictures of field hospitals and logistics units, or at least letting those pictures get to the internet without censoring them as much as they otherwise would. It's worth noting here that I think in 2018, the Russian military did a very hard crackdown on soldiers carrying their phones to exercises. Anybody with a VK account during the ZUP in 2017 could see virtually all of the briefings that the battalion and even brigade level commanders were giving to their troops, because they were just being posted onto VK by very bored conscripts who had nothing better to do. It's also had created some difficulties in reposting where certain units have moved, since you can no longer track individual soldiers moving around the country as easily as before. So as I was starting to say, General Breedlove was mentioning that he's now all of a sudden concerned because he is seeing a number of these logistical backups now being reported from these concentration points, whereas they had not been there before. I am inclined to think that with the element of surprise completely lost here, this still remains a signaling exercise / demonstration of capabilities at the end of a training season as is normal, but that they are going to have as much fun with the fact that everybody's paying attention to these activities as they possibly can. So that's the attitude I want to leave everybody with, is that though this is quite concerning and we should be watching for any signals that we can get out of this, this is not the beginning of a major attack with all probability. I'll cover my butt just a little bit there, but I'd say 95% at least, this is not something that's going to turn into a major war. Perhaps the thing that should be pointed out, though, here is that there is a possibility that it only became that way because we, meaning the United States and the Ukraine, actually called out this activity relatively early, before the Russians had admitted that they were doing it. So perhaps it was supposed to be an attack, but because it became well known, they just decided to turn this into a relatively high-profile, attention-grabbing public relations event. The last piece that I'll bring up here is that a group of 15 ships from the Caspian flotilla have now passed into the Black Sea via the Strait of Kerch as of the 17th, if I remember correctly, so Saturday. These ships consist not of the large ships in the Caspian flotilla. Some may remember them shooting very famously a Caliber missile into Syria some years ago. Those larger ships are all still in the Caspian Sea doing their own controlled Maya Povierka for the end of the training season. What they have moved are some amphibious assault craft, so small descent ships into the Black Sea, which is in turn interesting, as you would expect that to be part of a larger offensive in which the Russians were going to seriously be looking at Odessa instead of so much Kherson Oblast itself. But again, if the ambition is much higher than just going after the reservoir, it's just more of a sign that this is a threat as opposed to an actual invasion, because to do an invasion that's going to get you everything up to as far as Odessa in Ukraine, Odessa out here near to Transnistria, that it would be a pretty enormous operation of the scale we had not seen even in the Warsaw Pact invasions of Czechoslovakia and Hungary in decades past. So definitely the largest operation we would have seen since World War II.
So Nicholas, if I may, just
yeah,
in order to send a clear message, or at least to make a proper make people that watch us a proper understanding of the situation in terms of the military aspect. So what, in terms of the military, given the balance of forces and terrain that you have just mentioned, what are the options, the real options in terms of the warfighting? I'm not talking about political dance, but warfighting the Russians could have and could exploit if it were to escalate, to a war.
From the current buildup.
Yes, with the current buildup.
So from the current buildup, there are effectively three major points to have here, or rather to bear in mind. So again, the concentration appears to be occurring in Voronezh Oblast with a couple of spillovers into Belgorod, one directly west of it, and then additional forces haven't been moved from the North Caucasus to Crimea, but so far not right on the border. You look at the strategic geography of the left bank of Ukraine, so the eastern half of the country, you can think of it in three macro pieces. The first, the far southern area here, running from the Russian border near Rostov-na-Don all the way to Kherson, is extremely open. It's been extremely difficult to maintain control over this place because there's nothing to naturally defend here for centuries. So you think back 100 years ago, this is where the black forces in the Russian Civil War were fighting. These were the big anarchists who managed to resist both the whites, the reds, and everybody else coming after them for some time. During the Second World War, this was an area where the Soviets were able to do a rapid breakthrough out of the Donbass region, enforcing the Nazis trying to defend the remainder of occupied Ukraine to extend their line dramatically so that additional Russian attacks Soviet attacks further north were able to more easily break through and ultimately retake Kiev back in 1943. And then even before that, this was just Cossack territory in the oldest classical sense of it. Even before that, this is the Kipchak territory that the Grand Princes of Kiev couldn't control because, again, it was so disposed to pastoralist movements since you couldn't defend it from anything that there was no proper settlement, which is why a number of the communities in this part of Ukraine only date back to the late Industrial Revolution era when coal suddenly became a major interest, whereas before then it was virtually uninhabited. So that's the furthest southern portion of Ukraine that would be easy to attack. Even out of Crimea, I would argue, though, you would not want to do it strictly according to the only three potential straits here. The big one, obviously, this one near Armyansk, this far eastern one, whose name I'm forgetting here, and then there's this one here in the middle of the reservoir, which was used at a couple of points during the Crimean War. It's not always open, but it's relatively easy to ford, even if the reservoir manages to get, reservoir is more of a swamp, manages to raise up higher. So it's not that it would be difficult, but you would certainly want those Caspian flotilla descent craft to assist you in moving across a larger range of the coastline here. But if you were to do that sort of attack that you could do relatively easily in terms of acquiring the terrain, most likely the target would be the canals linking Crimea to the Dnieper River that Ukraine has shut. So the main point here would be these places at Kakhovka. Again, you'd have to defend that pretty heavily, and the Russians have been communicating very loudly in the past couple of days that they have just finished building a whole bunch of a bunch of new canal systems within Crimea itself from the Belbek River to the cities, so that there would be a reduced necessity of having water resources within Crimea itself. That could, of course, be a feint that they were trying to say that they have solved the whole water crisis in order to get us to not think that they need the water. But that would be the most likely use of forces directly out of Crimea. The other one that I mentioned earlier is they could be using the descent craft to land near Odessa. Specifically, there's a whole bunch of not especially well-patrolled old Soviet piers near here. I believe the ones up, this particular one is especially open to a landing followed by an assertion because the Ukrainian forces are pretty forward deployed. Most of them are either in Kherson Oblast itself with a couple of others in the larger operational command south, or else have been forward deployed up to the line of control in the Donbass region. So the forces are defending the rear are relatively few and far between, though the Marines in Odessa would be happy to fight back if the Russians were to try something like that. The second region that would be used coming out of the Voronezh Oblast area would be coming south towards Kharkiv, and then, of course, the remainder of the Ukrainian-controlled Donbass from the north. This region is much more cragged than the areas further south, and it's alternatively canalized by a couple of medium-sized rivers, or else through a series of dried-out canyons. It makes for quite an interesting and beautiful scene if you ever go out there. There's a number of monasteries and chalk hills in this section of Russia, which leaves, again, some rather beautiful scenery, though also means that the freedom of movement is a lot more restricted. And so the Ukrainians don't need as many forces in order to do very sort of screening operations that they would in order to do a local defensive exercise. That said, again, the Ukrainian forces have to be pretty spread out simply because most of them are concentrated around the joint operation area in the Donbass. So the priority for the Ukrainians here would certainly be the defense of Kharkov, which I think is the second largest city in the Ukraine, if I remember trivia correctly. And
yes,
also,
I think so, yeah.
And also a major military industrial manufacturing point with a number of old Soviet schools that continue to train the Ukrainian military. So,
and the largest tank factory, I guess, and not only in Ukraine, but arguably in Europe, I guess.
Yeah, quite. I believe that factory is probably the largest in Europe. So that would be the priority for Ukrainian defense there. And I suspect that if this were to evolve into a major attack, the Russians would be prioritizing going after Kharkiv considerably more than trying to simply attack the Donbass from the north and extend the line, so to speak. The third macro component of the Ukrainian terrain is the area near Chernigov. This is much more classical Ukrainian territory. Chernigov is, of course, one of the old principalities of the Kiev and Rus era. So it's much more what you stereotypically would think of for Russia for classic terrain. There's sort of a wet but rolling area, a bit more idealized for both defensive and offensive maneuver warfare, as opposed to either being completely undefendable or else ideally suited to a defense. The advantage of going through Chernigov is obviously that it's the shortest route from Russia to Kiev and would certainly create a huge crisis. And honestly, if this is going to be a build-up to an attack, I would guess that this is where it would actually come through, only because this is not where we're expecting the fighting to be at the moment. This seems the least likely. I should point out this whole section of Russia here between Voronezh Oblast and Smolensk Oblast was sort of a demilitarized zone before 2014, because especially in the Yanukovych years, the idea was that Ukraine was going to be neutral in Europe. Neither going to be really part of the West, but it was equally not going to be joining with any Russian defense concept. It was only going to participate in a couple of peacekeeping operations. So because of that, Russia had a giant hole in its armed forces structure, and they moved the 20th Guards Army HQ out of Voronezh, where it had been before, to Mulino in Nizhny Novgorod, so east of Moscow. They've only moved that HQ back in, I believe, 2015, when they were creating the 1st Guards Tank Army around Moscow. That 1st Guards Tank Army got most of the units that the 20th Guards Army previously consisted of. So they had to create a whole bunch of new units, including moving a number of previously unattached units in the central military district over to this section of Russia to create the force distribution that there now is. But that process, though it took some time, appears now to be pretty much complete. There are two main divisions in this. The 3rd Motor Rifle Division, which is distributed between Voronezh and Belgorod, and the 144th Guards Motor Rifle Division distributed between Smolensk and Bryansk. Between those two, the 3rd Motor Rifle Division is by far the more visible. Again, that doesn't mean it's more capable, that simply means it does more visible exercises. I would suspect that if this actually is the build-up to an attack, this is going to be coming through the 144th Guards Motor Rifle Division, backed up by the 41st Army that's been moved into Voronezh Oblast, because it's not been part of the spectacle so far. So this is where the element of Maskirovka can still be somewhat preserved. Ukraine has the disadvantage here of being a large place with long frontiers. It's not like there's a shortage of options. But it would seem that the more we know about what the Russian buildup is, the more you have to sort of expect that it's not going to be the most obvious choice that they would use to exploit here. Perhaps the other important thing that we should bear in mind is that typically the Second Guards Army, which is based in the Volga region, would be the principal second echelon force that the Russians would move forward. This unit is somewhat down in strength at the moment because its premier unit, the 15th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, is deployed in Nagorno-Karabakh on its peacekeeping mission probably to the end of time because they won't want to remove it for some time. And so it has been it's been pretty invisible this last couple of weeks, which means that it probably still has some forces that would be used to defend against whatever a Western counterattack would be. So most likely they would be moving it either to the Moscow area or, as in Zapad 2017, they might be moving it closer to St. Petersburg and the Finnish border to prevent an unforeseen attack up that way.
Nick,
But,
so Nick,
yeah.
let's imagine that you are, Gerasimov, and you were given an order to really initiate war against Ukraine, and the objective of war would be to make a showcase that we are winning, and then of course conclude the war, having shown that we have been winning tactical engagements, okay, and that we sort of have controlled the escalation ladder all the way, while the political process would be going on, and with our victories, the Western actors would be even more willing to compel Ukrainians to peace. That's what we say here in Warsaw. What options would you consider? What would you do? Coming back to, if you were going back from Moscow to your headquarters, close to the, front, what would you do?
My options would be somewhat limited by what the West is deciding to do to reinforce Ukraine or to reinforce the Baltics or however else you might do it. But you would want to be moving to wherever the West isn't reinforcing, so that you, like you say, you win a sudden tactical victory and then abruptly declare, we don't want to escalate because this might turn into World War III. Let's negotiate now. Again, my emphasis here would probably be doing a sudden flash offensive towards Kyiv, probably not getting all the way to the city, but doing something that shows that you could very well have done so if you decided to exploit it, but then abruptly calling it off in order to say, that you...
So style of Georgian war when they stopped short of Tbilisi, right? Sort of. Right.
Yes. So my inclination, as I mentioned earlier, would probably be an offensive through Sumy and Chernigov oblasts. Mm-hmm. To me, that's the only one. Obviously, if you go straight for the Ukrainian capital, that might mean that the Zelensky government recognizes it needs to fight with absolutely everything it has. The other difficulty that emerges is that currently the ordinary population in Kyiv is pretty... I don't know what the right word is for it, but they're not paying close attention to the Donbass war on a day-to-day basis. And if the war is suddenly coming straight at them, then that might change. Other fronts I might consider would be to do the attack around Kharkiv itself, specifically to elicit some sort of new defeatist attitude there. For a long time, Kharkov did not have a strong Ukrainian identity, especially in 2014 itself. I would not go after Odessa for this flash because the Odessa people are actually very sympathetic to Russia. And if they had a way to join Russia peacefully, they, more than anyone else in Ukraine, probably would accept this as a fait accompli. And so as the Russian general staff, I would not want to change Odessa into a war zone that's potentially antagonistic to Russia in the longer term. The other option, of course, would be going after that access to the Dnieper River. And then as soon as you get it, after doing the rapid offensive, you would then say, okay, we're stopping here and we're going to negotiate because we don't want this to escalate. This would have the biggest short-term benefit, certainly, and as much as you would have access to the water. And you also have the relative benefit of, because this area is relatively underpopulated because of its long history of being unsettled, there would be the minimum civilian casualties. So I would suggest that either the southern Kherson Oblast flash or else the half sprint to Kiev would be the most likely options in order to specifically unbalance the enemy's political calculations. Though if the West were suddenly deploying, if NATO countries were suddenly deploying even a company's worth of forces, either to the Kiev neighborhood or else to Kherson Oblast, that would probably make it not worthwhile and would increase the chances of me just doing a move on Kharkiv instead. I don't think they are going to be doing a reinforcement of the Donbass in any visible sense. Perhaps the forces would be used there, but then they would be part of a continuous cycling out like we've seen over the past 7 years now. Doing a dramatic escalation in the Donbass, namely exactly where the Ukrainians are prepared and well as where the Ukrainians are expecting you, just does not seem to be a very smart option. In addition to which, they already possess the interior lines of communication. Extending that a slight bit further at this point really doesn't add any operational benefit to long-term control over the Donbass.
Okay, Nick, I think that we would stop here as a sort of encouragement for our viewers to continue watching us in another episode that for sure we'll record.
If I can add one last other thing that's going on at the moment, just for a minute here. They started a major exercise in the Arctic today, or yesterday. They're saying it's the largest in the post-Cold War Arctic. We'll see what it amounts to. But they moved their motor rifle brigade out of Pechenga, up on the northern side of the country, down to the Leningrad Oblast area. So it's interesting how the movements have continued over the past 2 weeks. Last point.
Okay, fair enough. And that would be highly interesting. Thank you, Nick, for the in-depth description of the situation as of the 20th of April, 2021, at 1:39 p.m. Warsaw time. My guest at Strategy and Future was Nicholas Myers. My name was Jacek Bartosiak. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.